The sun of ancient Egypt did not just give life. It blinded. People look at the towering pillars of 1200 BC and see glory. They see gold. They see a bridge to the gods. But the gods were silent, and the stone was soaked in something darker than ink. Behind the incense and the chanting, a machine was breathing. It was a machine made of flesh and fear. It did not want your prayers. It wanted your life. It wanted your daughters. This is not the history of pharaohs. This is the history of the shadows they cast. The heat in the spring of 1200 BC was not a warmth. It was a weight. In the great courtyard of Karnak, the air shimmered like a dying flame. The white sun turned the limestone floors into mirrors, blinding anyone who dared to look up. It smelled of old stone, baked dust, and the heavy, sweet rot of ceremonial incense. In the center of this blinding whiteness, a girl knelt. Her name was Nefertari. She was young, too young to know that her life was no longer hers. She felt the stone against her knees, hard, unforgiving, and hot. Around her, the rhythm of the temple moved with a slow, terrifying precision. 3 priests circled her. Their robes were stiff with starch. Their faces were masks of divine indifference. In their hands, bronze razors caught the light. The metal was polished until it looked like fire. The first stroke was cold. Nefertari did not move. She had been told to be still. She had been told that the gods were watching. One by one, the long, black strands of her hair fell. They drifted to the polished floor like the feathers of a slaughtered bird. The sound was a soft scrape, a gentle sound, a tender sound, but every scrape felt like a wound. To the world, this was a ceremony. To the priests, it was purification. They said the gods demanded her beauty. They said the gods required her silence. They said her childhood was a small price to pay for the favor of the heavens. They called it an honor. Behind her, in the deep shadows of the towering pillars, her father stood. His head was bowed. His hands were clenched. He repeated the words to himself like a prayer. It is an honor. It is a blessing. It is for the good of the family. But his eyes stayed on the ground. He could not look at the pile of black hair growing at his daughter's feet. He knew the truth that his lips refused to speak. The Temple of Amun was not a place of gifts. It was a place of hunger. Behind the painted walls and the gold-leaf statues, something ancient stirred. It was older than the pharaohs. It was older than the desert itself. It was the hunger for power, dressed in the robes of holiness. The priests did not serve the gods, they served the system. And the system was built on obedience. As the last strand of hair fell, Nefertari looked up. The sun was still white. The incense was still thick. But the girl who had entered the courtyard was gone. In her place was a servant. A number. A piece of property. The ritual was over, but the nightmare had only just begun. The temple had taken her name. Now, it was coming for her soul. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The Nile is the blood of Egypt, and the temples are its heart. But a heart can be cold. Across the river from Karnak lay the Temple of Mut. Here, the goddess was depicted as a mother, a protector, a queen. Her statues were tall, their eyes painted with lapis lazuli, staring into eternity. But the motherhood of the temple was not a soft embrace. It was a grip of iron. While Nefertari was being shorn of her identity, another girl stood in the damp, echoing chambers of Mut. Her name was Mutamuya. She was a child of the south, her skin the color of deep ebony, her eyes wide with a terror she was told to hide. The air here was different. It didn't smell of the open sun. It smelled of stagnant water, wet stone, and the sharp, metallic tang of bronze. The light came from flickering oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like reaching fingers on the walls. "Purify her," the head priest commanded. His voice was like grinding gravel. 5 figures surrounded the girl. 3 priests and 2 older women whose faces were etched with a terrifying emptiness. They led Mutamuya to a stone pool. The water inside was dark and still. It was not the living water of the Nile. It was water trapped in stone, heavy with salt and minerals. "Remove your garments," one priest ordered. Mutamuya hesitated. She was 10 years old. In her village, her mother's hands were the only ones that touched her. She clutched the rough linen of her tunic, her knuckles white. The silence of the chamber was suddenly broken by a sharp crack. A hand had struck her face. The blow wasn't meant to injure, but to erase resistance. The fabric was torn away. Mutamuya stood shivering, not from cold, but from the sudden, raw vulnerability of being exposed to the eyes of men who saw her only as wood or grain. Then, the washing began. The priests stepped forward. Their hands were large, their skin calloused. They dipped their palms into the salt water and began to scour her skin. In the language of the temple, this was a cleansing of the spirit. But the reality felt like an invasion. Their hands lingered. Their fingers moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had nothing to do with cleanliness. They inspected her like a merchant inspects a horse. Every limb, every curve, every inch of her young body was measured by their touch. Mutamuya began to cry. The tears were silent at first, hot tracks running down her cheeks. Then, a sob escaped her throat, a small, broken sound that echoed against the painted ceilings. The older women watching did not offer comfort. They did not reach out to hold her. Instead, they whispered among themselves, their voices cold and judgmental. "Look at her," one hissed. "She weeps. She resists the grace of the goddess." "Impurity," the other replied, nodding. "The fear in her eyes is proof. The darkness has not yet left her." To these women, a child's terror was not a sign of suffering. It was a sign of sin. They had been in the temple so long that they had forgotten the language of the heart. They only knew the language of the ritual. The priests ignored the tears. They continued their slow, methodical inspection, their faces lit by the orange glow of the torches. They spoke of divine holiness while their eyes remained empty of any human warmth. By the time they were finished, Mutamuya was not just wet and cold. She was broken. The temple had told her she was being made holy. But as she stood dripping on the cold floor, she felt only a deep, aching hollow where her childhood used to be. The goddess of motherhood had not protected her. The temple had claimed her, and in the heart of Egypt, once the temple claimed you, you belonged to the shadows. The girls did not arrive at the temple gates by accident. They were not chosen by stars or omens. They were brought there by the cold, calculating machinery of an empire. To understand the fate of Nefertari and Mutamuya, you must look past the gold. You must look at the ledges. The temples of Egypt were not just sanctuaries. They were banks. They were the largest landowners in the world. They owned the soil. They owned the water. They owned the rain. From the fertile mud of the Nile Delta to the jagged cliffs of Thebes, the temples commanded more wealth than the nobles and more labor than the pharaoh's army. They were a kingdom within a kingdom, a breathing machine of control that never slept. At the top sat the high priest. He was the mouthpiece of the gods. His word could move an army or starve a province. Beneath him was a vast pyramid of power, scribes who tracked every grain of wheat, ritualists who guarded the sacred secrets, and keepers of the grain who held the keys to life and death. And at the very bottom, beneath the visible glory, was the invisible majority. The servants, the singers, the weavers, and the women called Hemmet, the wives of the god. The title sounded holy. It sounded like a blessing. In reality, it was a brand. Inside the Temple of Amun at Karnak, the high priest's seal carried the weight of destiny. He could redirect a harvest with a single stroke of a reed pen. He could condemn a family to a lifetime of debt. The temple did not merely pray for the prosperity of the land, it owned the land's prosperity. They collected taxes in grain. They lent that grain at interest. They waited for the poor to stumble. When a farmer fell behind on his dues, the temple was patient. First, they took his surplus. Then, they took his fields. And when there was nothing left to give, no land, no grain, no hope, the priests offered a way out. A mercy. The gods are generous, they would say, their voices smooth and practiced. Give us your daughter. Let her serve in the house of light, and your sins of debt will be washed away. It was a transaction disguised as redemption. It was human currency. The records of these girls do not exist in the great hymns carved on the outer walls. If you look at the ancient papyri, you will find no mention of their names. No ink was spilled for their sorrow. Instead, you find numbers. One scroll from Thebes lists the production of the temple's workshops, 3,000 yards of fine linen woven in a single month. Another scroll mentions the acquisition of new girls for the house of Amun. No ages, no stories, just entries in a book of assets. Every girl had a role in this machine. Some ground barley until their backs bent and their joints cracked. Others swept the sacred floors until the dust filled their lungs. The chosen few, like Nefertari, were elevated. They were dressed in the finest linen. They were taught the hymns of the sun. They were made to perform before the towering, silent statues of the gods. The world saw them as pure. The world saw them as blessed. But purity in this place was a mask. Inside the hidden chambers, away from the eyes of the public, the silence was heavy. The marble courtyards sparkled under the midday sun, but the women within them moved like ghosts. Their voices, which were once meant for songs of joy, had become whispers of survival. They were living property, unpaid labor hidden behind a veil of devotion. The temple system was built on this silence. It was a perfect circle of power. To question the cruelty of the priests was to question the divinity of the gods. And in 1200 BC, no one dared to look the gods in the eye. No child ever walked willingly through the gates of a temple. They did not skip toward the towering pylons with dreams of holiness. They were brought in chains, in tears, or in the hollow silence of despair. There were 3 paths that led a girl into the belly of the machine, and all 3 ended in the same place, the loss of a soul. The first path was the path of debt. As we have seen, the temples were the banks of the ancient world. They did not just store grain, they controlled the survival of the peasantry. When the Nile failed to rise, or when the pharaoh's taxes became too heavy, a father would turn to the priests. He would take a loan to feed his family. But temple interest was a hungry ghost. It grew faster than the wheat. When the man could not pay, the priests did not send soldiers first. They sent mercy. Your daughter, they would whisper, is a gift the gods will accept in place of silver. The father would bow his head. He would tell himself she would live in a palace. He would tell himself she would eat the finest bread. But the moment the debt was cleared, the girl became a line item in a ledger. Her freedom was the price of her father's breath. The second path was piety, born from the womb of fear. In times of plague or drought, the air in the villages became thick with superstition. The people believed the gods were angry. They believed the sun was burning them because of their sins. To appease the invisible powers, parents would offer their most precious possession. They would bring their daughters to the temple as a sacrifice of living flesh. The priests would smile gently. They would tell the mothers, "Your child will live in light. She will serve beside the divine." These words were a script, rehearsed over 1,000 years. But once the heavy bronze doors swung shut, the mother's name was erased from the girl's memory. If the mother cried, it was called weakness. If she doubted the priests, it was called blasphemy. The girl was gone, swallowed by a holiness that never looked back. The third path was the cruelest: tribute and conquest. Egypt's shadow reached far beyond its borders. Its armies swept through the sands of Libya and the gold-rich lands of Nubia. They did not just return with cattle and cedar wood. They returned with human spoils. This was how Izuri came to the temple. She was only 10 years old when the drought struck her Libyan village. When the Egyptian soldiers arrived demanding tribute for the pharaoh, there was no grain left to give. Her mother, trembling, brushed the dust from Izuri's cheeks and whispered, "The gods will feed you. You will live." But the soldiers did not bring food. They brought ropes. Izuri was marched across the burning desert, chained to dozens of other children. She imagined she was going to a palace of gold. Instead, she was brought to the great Temple of Thebes. To the soldiers, she was a number. To the priests, she was a gift from the conquered. They greeted her with smiles, telling her she had been chosen. But there was no choice. In the language of faith, chosen was simply another word for taken. These girls were the currency of empires, traded between the hands of powerful men. They were not servants of the gods. They were the grease that kept the gears of the temple turning. Before a girl could be a servant, she had to be a ghost. The priests called the next stage initiation. But in the cold reality of the inner chambers, it was a systematic breaking of the human spirit. They did not want a girl with memories of a home, a mother, or a name. They wanted a vessel, empty, silent, and hollow. For Nefertari, the final breaking began at dawn. The temple doors, massive and reinforced with bronze, closed behind her with a sound like a hammer hitting a tomb. It was a sound that signaled the end of the world she knew. She was led to a stone pool in a room where the sun never reached. The only light came from flickering torches that smelled of animal fat. 5 figures waited for her in the gloom. 3 were priests, their heads perfectly bald and gleaming. 2 were older women, including Tayat, a priestess whose eyes were no longer windows to a soul, but mirrors of resignation. "Remove your garments," a priest ordered. When Nefertari hesitated, the air in the room seemed to freeze. A sharp slap echoed against the stone walls, stinging her skin and her pride. The linen was torn away. She stood trembling, exposed, while the purification ritual began. The priests dipped their hands into the water. It was cold and heavy with salt. They began to wash her, but it was not the gentle bath of a child. Their hands were slow. Their eyes were calculating. They called it a ritual of cleansing, but their touch lingered in ways that made Nefertari want to scream. But she had already learned the first rule of the temple: scream, and the gods will punish you. Silence was her only shield, even if it felt like a cage. Across the river, Mutamuya was undergoing the same ordeal. When the cold water hit her head, she gasped for air. The women standing by did not comfort her. They laughed. To them, her fear was a sign of impurity. They believed that if she were truly holy, she would feel no cold, no fear, and no shame. Her tears were washed away by the same salt water used to scour the blood of sacrificed animals from the floor. Then came the razors again. This time, they were not just cutting hair. They were erasing identity. Every strand was scraped away, her scalp, her eyebrows, even her eyelashes. Hair was a woman's beauty. It was a memory of how her mother used to braid it by the river. Now, it was gone. When Nefertari was forced to look into a polished bronze mirror, she did not recognize the person staring back. She saw a pale, hairless stranger with eyes full of ash. "You are reborn," Tayat whispered. But her voice lacked conviction. She had said those words to hundreds of girls. She knew they weren't being reborn into life. They were being reborn into a machine. The final act was the renaming. The names their mothers had whispered to them in the dark were forbidden. Nefertari was given a title that meant beautiful is the lady. Mutamuya became hand of the goddess. Their pasts were erased from the temple records. To the world, they had never been children. They had always been this, shorn, silent, and owned. The ceremony ended with the divine marriage. The girls were dressed in stiff, white silk and led before the towering statues of the gods. They were made to repeat vows they did not understand. "My body is yours. My life is your property." When the last word was spoken, the priests stepped back. The heavy incense swirled around the gold-plated feet of the statues. The temple now owned them completely, their labor, their silence, and their very breath. Only Tayat stayed in the shadows, her hands trembling. For the first time in 30 years, she looked at the silent statue of a moon and wondered if anyone was truly behind the mask of gold. The temple did not just want the girls' labor, it wanted their legacy. It wanted to ensure that when they died, nothing of their true selves remained. For years, the rhythm of the stone halls crushed the spirit. Every morning began before the sun, with the cold strike of a bronze gong. Dozens of girls, bald and barefoot, would rise from straw mats to wash, to weave, and to pray. To serve is joy, the priests chanted. To obey is peace. But peace is not the same as silence. Nefertari grew old within those walls. Her hands, once soft, became calloused from the looms. Her voice, once bright, became a dry whisper. She watched as her own daughter was taken from her arms to serve the same divine machine. She saw the same razors, heard the same lies, and felt the same hollow ache. The cycle was perfect. It was a machine that fed on the hearts of women to build monuments for men. The priests believed they had won. They believed that by erasing names and shaving heads, they had deleted the humanity of their servants. They wrote their own glory on the outside of the temple walls, huge, sweeping hieroglyphs of battles won and gods appeased. They thought the official record was the only truth. They were wrong. Deep in the shadows, where the torches flickered low, a different history was being written. It was not written in gold or carved by royal stonemasons. It was written in secret. Tayat, the old priestess who had watched Nefertari and Mutamuya break, could no longer carry the weight of the lies. In the final years of her life, she began to steal scraps of papyrus from the temple storerooms. Using a reed pen and ink made of soot, she recorded the truth. She wrote the names the girls were born with. She wrote about the lingering hands of the priests during purification. She wrote about the mothers who stood in the desert and the daughters who were traded for grain. The gods took nothing, she wrote, her hand shaking with a courage she had found too late. Only men did. She did not share her writings. She knew the punishment for truth was death. Instead, she wrapped the papyrus in linen, sealed it with beeswax, and hid it beneath the foundation stones of the servants' quarters. She whispered a prayer, not to a moon, but to the earth itself. If the gods are silent, let the stones one day speak. Thousands of years passed. The empire of the pharaohs crumbled into the sand. The gold was looted. The names of the high priests were forgotten. The great temple of Karnak became a ruin, a skeleton of a civilization that thought it would last forever. When archaeologists finally cleared the dust of 3 millennia, they found the statues and the grand inscriptions. But they also found something else. They found the hidden bundles. They found the tiny scratches on the back of pillars where a woman had once carved, "I existed." They found Tayat's papyrus, the ink faint but the words burning with a fire that time could not extinguish. The world calls these ruins beautiful. They admire the symmetry and the scale. But the true story of Egypt is not in the height of the pillars. It is in the silence between them. It is in the memory of the girls who were told they were nothing, but who refused to be forgotten. The sun still shines on the stones of Karnak. The tourists still walk where Nefertari once knelt. The guides still speak of glory. But if you stand very still, away from the noise of the crowds, you can almost hear it. A soft scrape of a razor. A muffled sob in a salt pool. A whisper carried on the desert wind. History tries to bury the weak to exalt the powerful. But truth has a way of breathing through the sand. The temples were built on obedience and pain, but the voices of the silent have finally outlived the gods who claimed them. You have heard them now. You are their witness. The silence is finally broken. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.